Chapter 13. Bullet hooked school the next day. He just got off the bus and went his own way. The thick triple story of brick waited like a prison, and he didn't go in. Nobody could make him. They could, he guessed, capture him and drag him inside, if they could get a rope onto him, which he doubted. Anyway, the question never arose. Hanging onto his lunch bag, he moved around the building and down to the playing fields. A couple of first-period gym classes were doing calisthenics, but he went on by them. Nobody asked any questions. If anybody had, he wouldn't have answered, and if they'd come chasing after him, he wouldn't have run. Nobody was going to make him run. At the oval track, he put down his lunch bag and stripped off his sweater and jeans. He folded them into a little pile, the bright red sweater on the brown earth. It was chilly, but the sun was already burning off the morning mist, and the day would grow warm. He ran the cross-country course, ran it 5 times, ran it hard. Nobody was going to stop him from running. When the sweat on his chest had dried, he put on his shirt and tied the sweater around his waist by its arms. He walked along down into town, following the main street right up to where it ended at the water. Then he followed the water around to Patrice's, going through shallows where there was no public pathway. By the time he got out there, his sneakers were sodden and muddy, and his jeans clung to his calves. Patrice wasn't home. His truck was gone. Bullet went out and sat on the deck of Fraternity for a long while. He would have hosed her down, except she was always kept clean. He ate his sandwiches, then went back along the dock to drop the crumbled-up bag into Patrice's incinerator. He hung around the yard for a while, seeing what Patrice was up to. The 14-footer was almost finished. The ribs were in, and the boards ran its entire curved length, fitted so neatly you almost couldn't see that it was made of separate boards. A new transom lay nearby, needing sanding before it could be set into place, the joints cut out like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Bullet ran his hands along the sides of the boat, sanded to silky smoothness, ready for an undercoat. He didn't know how Patrice stood it, all that slow work, but he surely admired the results, and even admired Patrice for being able to achieve them. He turned and looked around the yard. A couple of hulls, an empty boat trailer digging its nose into the ground, motors and propellers. Then he stepped over the picket fence. The road by Patrice's was lined on both sides with little houses, each house surrounded by a yard and fence. The other yards, past which Bullet jogged, were planted and tended, kept neat. It bothered his neighbors that Patrice didn't plant and tend his lawn. Every now and then somebody would write him a note, anonymous of course, or a group of men would come to try to talk to him about keeping up the neighborhood. Patrice never minded them, but it made Bullet mad, and these little boxed-in, gussied-up yards didn't show him anything either. His return route took him through one of the colored sections, not the high-income one. That was downtown. This was shacks along the roadside, built from tar paper over cinder block footings, or old trailers with patches of vegetable gardens beside them, or once even an old bus, with a bedspread hung for a door. Bullet jogged past the section fast. It made him angry. He arrived home by mid-afternoon and went right upstairs to get his gun. He stopped in the kitchen for a couple of glasses of milk, which he drank standing up, looking out the window over the sink. He could see his mother off around the corner, checking the sheets on the clothesline. They weren't dry yet, but a late afternoon breeze was building up, and that would probably finish the job. The cool milk flowed down his throat. He heard heavy footsteps behind him, the old man. He didn't turn around, didn't hurry himself. He felt the old man's anger wash over him from behind and almost smiled. Slowly he lifted the glass to empty it. Slowly he turned on water, rinsed the glass, set it down slowly on the washboard. He wondered what the old man would do if he turned around to face him. He'd said he didn't want to lay eyes on Bullet. What would he do if Bullet turned around? Run out of the room? Bullet turned around. His father was staring at the toes of his shoes, and his eyes didn't even flicker, so Bullet knew the man had been staring at them all the time he'd been standing there. He could have laughed. "There is nothing quite so childish as getting even by wanton destruction," the old man said to his shoes. Bullet wondered what would happen if 10 little voices answered back, "Yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir," overlapping one another like waves coming into shore. He stared at his father's bent head, to where the face began, under the white crown. He stared hard. wanting to force the guy to look up and eat his words. "You'll repair the damage you did?" "I did what I was told. They're closed now. I checked that." "They'll need to be completely rebuilt now." "So what?" "Then rehung on new hinges. The orders came marching out. You'll have to rebuild the frame first." "You can't make me." "If not right away, you'll have to do it sooner or later, whenever." Bullet knew what he was about to get to. Huh? "You're not going to do that to me. When it's yours, you can't make me. So that you have succeeded only in fouling your own nest, like any other animal, like some nigger. I am not surprised at that, not surprised at all." "Not going to hang around my neck, box me in with it, use it that way, take it away from me," because nothing felt under his feet the way the rich, flat acres of home did. "Because the farm is yours, or as good as. Not that I particularly want to give it to you." "You don't want to give it to anyone. You want to pull it into your grave after you like some blanket. And I hope it chokes you like it choked me." Anger burned up in Bullet's guts and his bones closed in around it. He got his hands on his gun and got out of his room. His father wanted to make Bullet take it from him because he hated it. He couldn't make Bullet take anything from him. Nobody could do that, but nobody. They kept trying to box him in, and he kept breaking out, and he'd keep on breaking out, damn them. He went around behind the barn and into a thin patch of woods. He moved fast, and his noisy progress rooted 2 rows out of the branches. Without thinking, he shouldered, cocked, aimed the gun, and fired twice. He got one. Not bad. Even with this second-rate gun, his marksmanship was okay, maybe even good. When he could pick up the Smith & Wesson in Salisbury, he'd be good enough for it. Bullet slowed down, moving more quietly. In another couple of weeks the hunting season would begin, and he'd have to get himself a bright orange hat. But now he didn't have to worry about being picked off by some jerk from some city who mistook him for a deer or maybe a duck. He thought, sliding the clip into place and shoving the bolt home. If he saw some ducks, he might shoot for them. Game wardens stayed home as long as they could, earning their salaries by shuffling papers on a desk until they had to get out into the cold to actually keep an eye on things. It wasn't even cold yet, just crisp in the shady woods. If he flushed any ducks and was close enough, he might just shoot for them. Who'd see him here? Who could catch him? All of his senses alert, he walked the woods and the fields as the afternoon gathered in around him. Once he got a shot at a rabbit, off to the left inlaid, but he missed. He opened the bolt, picked up the empty casing, and jammed it into his pocket, then slid the bolt home again, hearing the bullet click into place. For a while he sat in a clearing, just in case a deer might come browsing by near enough to justify trying for it. Across the open space, the bare trees rose into the gray sky, each branch clear. A breeze flowed along the land, running for the water. It sobbed through the pines, and the top-heavy loblollies swayed under their hands. No deer came by. When Bullet moved back into the woods, it was twilight there, darker than in the open, the light dim and shadowy. He stopped, pulled his sweater over his head, and then, holding the .22 ready like a pistol at his right hip, he tossed a couple of dead branches up into a pine, seeing if anything flushed out. Nothing moved. But something moved off to his right, low and on the ground, and at the edge of his vision. He got the shot off before he even properly saw, a sweet reflex shot, his whole body coordinated and working like a perfect machine. A good shot, too. He heard the cry and the muffled thud of a small body falling to the ground in mid-movement. His hands worked the bolt to reload the barrel automatically as he went over to the bushes to see what he'd gotten. O.D., the stupid mutt, lay on her side with blood coming out every time she breathed. Her eyes were closed. Bullet knew what he had to do next. He raised the gun to his shoulder and aimed just behind her left eye. At this range, even this gun wouldn't fail him. "I told you," he said to her. He hooked his finger around the trigger. He wanted to do this in one clean shot. Why did she have to be so stupid? At the sound of his voice, she opened her eye and her tail wagged a couple of times. It barely rustled the leaves and branches she lay on. "You stupid mutt," Bullet said. "What am I supposed to do?" The tail moved again, and she tried to lift her head to see him, but apparently she couldn't. Bullet crouched down beside her and took a look at the wound. It was a kind of ragged hole in her rib cage. She tried to turn, tried to get up, her front legs kind of scrabbled, and her chest heaved. Her back legs didn't move at all. Blood came out of the hole, slow and steady. "What did you think you were doing?" he demanded. But she hadn't been thinking, and now look what had happened. She'd just been following him around and got in the wrong place at the wrong time. Stupid, just like Liza, and wagging her tail at him when he'd just pumped lead into her. Bullet forced his rib cage outward with a breath. Not his fault, he knew that. His rib cage and then the banded muscles of his diaphragm closed in again, putting pressure on his lungs. She walked into it. Time and again, over and over, he'd sent her home. The stupid dog just wouldn't learn. He forced breath into his lungs. He felt like kicking her. It made him angry, what she'd done. His muscles bunched together and moved with anger. He rose, bent to pick up the .22, stared down at the dog making a puddle of dark blood on the dried pine needles. She lay there uncomplaining, breathing, bleeding, dying. It wasn't his fault, but he had fired the shot, and now what was he supposed to do? He felt boxed in, helpless, caught in somebody else's trap, like always. He needed to yell, he needed to move, but before the sides of the box pushed him in all around and crushed him. He felt himself explode into action, swinging his arms, and he cracked the .22 against the twisted trunk of the swamp oak. The shock of the impact ran along his bones, jarring the shoulder socket and moving on, like a lightning bolt, down through the muscles of his back. He slammed it again and again. The noise he was making with his voice had no meaning, it just exploded out of him. At last the gun broke, snapped apart where the barrel joined the stock. The barrel flew off into the dark woods, landing with a crash. He threw the stock after it, listening to it fly through branches and crash down somewhere in the dark circle beyond visibility. He was breathing heavily. He turned to look down at O.D. before walking away. Her ears were up, listening. She didn't even know what was going on. Bullet sat down on the rough ground by her head. "All right," he said aloud, "but hurry up." He put one hand on her head, rubbing a little with his fingers. He could feel the shape of her skull underneath the smooth hair. Her skull fit into his hand. If he wanted to, he could take his 2 hands and crush that circle of bone. If she'd been in pain, he would have. His fingers moved behind her floppy ears, along the edge of the delicate layer of bone. She was small, O.D., smaller even than that kid in the picture Frank showed him. Liza's kid. He didn't believe Liza had gone and had a kid with Frank for the father, and maybe 2. How stupid could anyone be? "You're not looking too smart to me right now," he told himself. "It wasn't my fault," he answered. "Yeah, but it was your responsibility. Well, I'm accepting that, so shut up." He shut up. O.D. breathed slowly, patiently, waiting. Bullet breathed beside her, waiting. Night settled slowly in around them, sifting in among the trees. She wasn't complaining, O.D. She wasn't scared. Little night noises moved around them, scurrying and fluttering. The rustle of leaves and sometimes a distant motor, some boats moving back to harbor. Bullet felt the hard ground under his backside and his legs. His shoulders rested back against a fallen tree. His one hand rested on O.D.'s skull, the little finger going down along her neck to register the shallow rise and fall of her breathing. He sat between anger and sad. They felt the same, the sad and the anger. He could see the shapes of the trees and the massy shape of undergrowth, but nothing more. He could see, turning his head slightly, the whitish shape of O.D. "I'm sorry, O.D.," he finally spoke aloud. He barely recognized his own voice. He heard a rustle of dried pine needles where her tail was. "I don't know. I wish you hadn't walked into it. I wish I hadn't taken that shot. I didn't mean to." If she knew anything, which he doubted, she'd know that was true. Which didn't make any difference. "You're such a stupid mutt, O.D.," his voice said, trying to tell her, "but you've been okay." And she couldn't possibly understand. He knew that. "You've been an okay dog, all things considered." Shut up, he told himself. Well, she was. Night folded in over them. The wind picked up, and he could no longer hear O.D.'s breathing. He could only feel it through his fingers. The moon must have risen because the woods were infiltrated with silver clouds of light that made patches of dark shadows. The shadows moved where they ran through trees. The wind washed over Bullet. He didn't move. He stayed and waited. He had no idea how much time passed, and he didn't care. And then quietly, O.D. was no longer breathing, because he had killed her. He got up, stiff and angry, but he was angry at himself. He didn't know what to do about that. "Johnny was right, you're a breaker," he told himself. "She had courage. She was nothing but a stupid mutt, and she did it right. Good for you, O.D."